Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Rams History. And today we'll be discussing the First Industrial Revolution. Now, it's important to remember, ladies and gentlemen, that the Industrial Revolution is not only a revolution in production, although that's often how we think about it. It is also, remember, a revolution in consumption. It's this new demand for consumer goods that drives an awful lot of the production that we see during the Industrial Revolution. So you have to think about this economic issue from both sides of the coin. It's not just about production, it's also about consumption. So it's not just supply, but also demand. And what we see during the Industrial Revolution is a growth of a new consumer economy. For example, China. Wedgwood China was marketed in Britain, and the company that manufactured that china would often manufacture it for nobles, for the wealthy, for the royal family. And then what they would do is they would make copies that were less expensive, and they would then market those copies to the middle and working classes. So in a sense, what they were doing there was creating a demand, because again, the lower classes would see this china in use by the upper classes, and they would want to do the same. So in a sense, what's being done here is the creation of a new consumer economy driven by desire for consumer goods, and that will start and spread. And this, of course, will create sort of much of the Western economy that we know today. Now, another important note about the Industrial Revolution is that it does begin in Britain, and there were actually a number of very good reasons for this. First of all, Britain was home to London. London was the largest city in Europe at the time, had a very large population of somewhere around 1 million people. And many Britons had been to London or lived there. And of course, it's in London that this consumer economy really starts to develop. People see products being advertised in the papers, or they see items in shops as they're making their daily business. And of course, it creates demand for these consumer goods. So that's an awful lot of it. Something else England benefited from was the fact that ever since the end of the English Civil War, England had had a very solid and stable government. Now, you have to remember, ladies and gentlemen, that business thrives on stability, and Britain certainly had that. So that strong, stable government which enforced laws, protected property rights, and taxed fairly was a very important key in Britain's growth as an industrial leader. Now, something else unique to Britain is that Britain was very socially mobile. Now, certainly Britain did have classes like other countries, but if you had money, you could sort of rise socially. So it wasn't like certain places where aristocracy was limited by birth. In Britain, you could sort of rise in social class based upon your wealth. And certainly there were instances in Britain of people who began perhaps as working class and then through their industry or hard work or effort managed to rise up into the middle class or higher. So Britain does have a fairly wealthy, socially mobile population. And finally, Britain had a great deal of resources, both man-made and natural. Britain had a lot of iron ore, a lot of coal deposits. It also had, of course, good roads. It had a large free trade area in a sense where trade goods could move across Britain without any type of taxation. And Britain also had waterways as well, because canals in many ways were some of the early transportation networks. So Britain has a lot of advantages working for it, and that's really why the Industrial Revolution will begin there. Now, one of the first areas of production that really felt the impact of industrialization was that of textiles. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, a lot of textile production was done through what was called the domestic system, sometimes called the putting out system. Essentially, this was largely done in many cases by working women, where an entrepreneur would obtain raw materials and things. He would give these to the women. The women would then spin the thread or produce the cloth or what have you. And then after a given time, the entrepreneur would come back. He would pay the women for their work. He'd give them a new set of raw materials, and he would collect the finished products. Now, the advantage of this system is that it allowed women to work out of their homes, and therefore they could kind of arrange their work around their lives. So things like childcare and other issues could also get taken care of. So in many ways, it was a convenient system, not only for the women who benefited from it, but from the entrepreneurs who did as well. Now, however, it did have downsides. It could not produce a great deal of goods, and it really depended, I guess, on the skill of the woman. If she was very skilled and talented, she could get an awful lot of work done. If she was learning or not perhaps as talented, the level of production was low. So it was a convenient system that, for the most part, benefited both parties, but in terms of its productive capacity, it was fairly low. Now, the textile industry will be transformed by a series of inventions. First of all, the flying shuttle. This made weaving cloth much faster and simpler, and it also, of course, put an awful lot of skilled weavers out of work. Now, something else that came along was the spinning jenny. The flying shuttle had made the production of cloth much more rapid, but it was delayed because spinners could simply not spin enough thread quickly enough to meet the demand. However, the spinning jenny was developed, and this, of course, changes that bottleneck because now thread can be produced just as rapidly as the cloth can be. Now, finally, another invention that was developed was by a gentleman named Richard Arkwright, and he developed what was called the water frame. Now, this essentially created a spinning jenny tied to a water wheel. And so now, essentially, instead of the work being done by hand, it's actually done by a form of power, first water and later steam. And this, of course, is when manufacturing really begins to move into factories. The average family or entrepreneur could not afford these machines. Only a factory owner could do so. So an awful lot of the means of production is now beginning to move to factories and out of the home. Although it's important to understand this change didn't happen right away. The domestic system actually continued in operation until well into the 19th century before it was finally replaced by factory work. Now, of course, the next big development is when James Watt really improves the steam engine. Now, Watt himself did not invent the steam engine, but what he did do was make improvements to it, which made it much more practical. And with the development of the steam engine, factories are no longer tied to water. The initial factories had to be built along a water source, which would in turn power a wheel, which would provide the factory with its power. But this is no longer necessary with Watt's steam engine. You can now build factories away from a water source, and the steam engine begins to become the real engine of the Industrial Revolution, because for the first time in history, we're not depending on human power or animal power, which gets tired or wants to eat or goes on strike. We now have a source of power that can work as long as there's fuel. All right, another area that really profits in Britain is the production of iron. Now, Britain had a great deal of deposits of iron ore, and of course, that production will increase dramatically. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, Britain produced about 25,000 tons of iron a year, but notice how the production skyrockets, and in fact, by the middle of the 19th century, England is producing more than 4 million tons of iron ore a year. A lot of this had to do with improvements in the process in making iron. For example, Henry Cort developed a process called puddling. What this did is it removed a lot of the impurities out of the iron and made it much stronger. And thanks to this, iron production skyrockets. Now, as production increases, the cost of iron drops, and as a result, iron becomes much more commercially available for construction and other things, which in turn generates more economic activity. Now, another hallmark of the Industrial Revolution is rapid urban growth. All across Europe, you start to see an explosion in cities, both new cities and in the growth of old cities. And this, in turn, is going to create a whole new set of problems that Europe had previously not encountered before. Now, most European societies had an urban social classes that were basically made up of more or less 4 ranks. If you want to think of this as like a 4-story building, you had your upper class, which of course were your nobles, bankers, the clergy, government officials, elected officials, things like that. Below that, you had a middle class, which were made up of merchants, professional people, doctors, lawyers, teachers, things like that. as well as trade masters, so men who had really risen to the top of their trade and were sort of, considered to be masters, owned their own shops and things like that. Below that, you had the artisans. These were generally people who worked with their hands, so grocers, butchers, blacksmiths, printers, fishmongers, people along those lines, apprentices who were trying to work their way up in the trades. And then finally, at the very bottom of society, you had the urban poor. Now, these are unfortunately the kind of people that are encountered in almost any city even today. You had day laborers who kind of worked by the sweat of their brow. You had beggars, prostitutes, criminals, that sort of group as well. And these sort of ranks make up the typical urban society in 18th century Europe. Now, the Industrial Revolution did cause some dislocation. The Industrial Revolution long-term will lead to a huge improvement in the standard of living, less expensive consumer goods, but in the short term, it did lead to a lot of dislocation. Women, for example, experienced a great deal of dislocation. Now, previously, because of the domestic system, women had been a very important part of the production process, making thread and weaving cloth in their homes. And women had also been quite important in agricultural endeavors as well, working in the fields and things like that. However, with the development of the factory system, the production of textiles moves out of the home and into the factory, and generally into the hands of men and away from women. And also, as we talked about earlier with the agricultural revolution, the development of machines like the threshing machine and various cutting and harvesting machines will render a lot of women's work in agriculture obsolete as well. So in some ways, women are kind of pushed backwards by the Industrial Revolution. They're sort of pushed back into the home, back into a more domestic role, and sort of away from a more active role in the economy. Now, these social dislocations did meet with opposition. In Britain, there was a group known as the Luddites. And the Luddites oftentimes would smash these new water frames and things like that were manufacturing textiles. Now, unfortunately today, the Luddites are often seen as people who were opposed to new technology. Now, that's not really entirely true. The Luddites were workers who were trying to get better working conditions and really only resorted to smashing machinery after, in many cases, the factory owners had ignored their requests. Now, as it turns out, organizing workers was very difficult to do because the British government passed what was called the Combination Act in 1799, and that essentially made forming unions or doing any type of collective bargaining illegal. So it was extremely difficult for workers in industrial Britain to really sort of organize or get together. And unfortunately, as a result, this early period of industrialization is kind of an example of almost unrestrained capitalism. Where factory owners and things could take advantage of workers because labor was cheap, workers were plentiful, and anyone who attempted to strike or somehow better their condition could simply be very quickly replaced by a new set of workers. Now, in France, there's another term that comes to our language today, sabotage. The wooden shoes worn by many peasants were known as sabots. And according to the story, these workers would sometimes throw their shoes into the new machinery to try to damage it. Others believe the word sabotage comes from the sound that the wooden shoes would make on the pavement as workers were striking. So then, this is another term, referring to the time when workers were attempting to better their condition through strikes, or in some cases through more direct means, such as damaging or sabotaging equipment. Now, these new cities also had an abundance of problems in terms of public health. Disease was very common, crowding was very common, housing was poor, and as this illustration here shows, the conditions in the cities were often filthy. And this did lead to a lowering of life expectancy in some cases, and also a very high infant mortality. So again, a lot of these problems were sort of fairly new problems because this growth in cities was unprecedented. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French observer who traveled to Britain, and he actually spoke about this. He said, "From this foul drain, the greatest stream of human industry flows out to fertilize the whole world. From this filthy sewer, pure gold flows." Here humanity attains its most complete development and its most brutish. Here civilization works its miracles and civilized man is turned almost into a savage. So again, he's talking about these brutal conditions in these industrial cities. William Hogarth was an English artist who had a bit of a social conscience, and he actually did a number of works talking about conditions among the urban poor. This was one of his works known as Gin Lane. So for example, in the foreground here, you can see a woman who is obviously so poor she's been reduced to prostitution. She's practically naked and covered in sores, and she's so focused on her snuff and on her drink that she fails to notice her child falling off the steps to its death. In the background, you can see workers pawning their tools to buy a few more ounces of gin. There's a barber who has committed suicide in the background, I guess because no one's getting haircuts anymore. Everyone wants to go and drink. So Hogarth's works were drawn from life, and obviously he's very concerned about the dislocation caused by the Industrial Revolution and the fact that many people are turning to alcohol and things to try to ease their lives. So we want to do a quick summary here. What are the results? Well, long term, the Industrial Revolution is a great benefit to the West. Productivity goes up, consumption goes up, consumer goods become far more available and less expensive, and eventually all of this will result in an increase in wages and a better standard of living for almost everyone. However, in the short term, there's a lot of dislocation and unemployment. As I mentioned, there's a lot of disruption here, especially for skilled workers. They're being replaced by machinery. Many of these workers actually experience a decrease in the standard of their living. There is increased urbanization. All across Europe, cities grow, and this, of course, in turn leads to problems with housing, poverty, crime, and public health, which in some instances are still problems cities are dealing with today. Now finally, these early industrial workers do meet with a great deal of difficulty in trying to establish unions or organize, and many of their early efforts to improve their working conditions will meet with failure. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I did hope you enjoyed this next episode of Rams History, and as always, if you do enjoy, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.